Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. So my name's Dan Holevoet, and I'm an engineer on Google's developer relations team. And I'm going to talk to you today about how you can launch your app inside of Google Apps using gadgets. And while I'm presenting here, we're going to use Wave as we've been doing in some of the other sessions. We'll have live notes taken inside of the Wave. And if you have any questions that you want to ask while I'm presenting, you can feel free to add those inside of Google Moderator in the Wave. So just go to this bit.ly URL that I have in the slide here, and I'll give you a second if you want to open that up. And if you don't grab this URL, well, it's up here. You can actually go to my session information on the Google I/O website too and get the URL there. So what are we going to talk about today? So here's a quick little agenda for you. The first thing, why gadgets? Why are you here? Why do you care? Basic motivation for developing these gadgets. Some details on what gadgets are, where gadgets work, some common tasks and best practices that will help you out while you're writing these gadgets, some information on how to distribute these gadgets, an example application that I wrote that will demonstrate some of the things that I've been showing you, and then finally, hopefully I'll have convinced you all to go out and start writing these yourselves, and we have some information on how you can get started. And then, of course, we'll do some Q&A at the end. So first, why gadgets? Well, how many of you are Google Apps users? Hopefully I get a few hands. Oh, nice. OK. Right. So how many of you spend a lot of your day inside of Google Apps? All right. OK, that's fairly common. And I can imagine for a lot of you, once you start using Google Apps, it's really where you want to do all of your work, right? And you'll come to a point where you actually find it really inconvenient to go outside of apps to do something and then have to come back because Google Apps is where you do all of your work. It's your workflow is inside of Google Apps. And so gadgets let you take pieces of the other applications that you find valuable and bring them into Google Apps. They then become part of your workflow, right? So we can see in this diagram here, we have some really cool app that does this really critical piece of, for our business. And we can take that app and we can put it inside of all of the Google Apps that we use on a daily basis so that we don't have to leave Google Apps, do some piece of work and then come back, right? We can just integrate this little piece of functionality inside of the Google Apps that we're in already every single day. So what are gadgets? At the simplest level, gadgets are XML, HTML, and JavaScript, right? They're little embedded web pages inside of Google Apps. You can see a really simple example gadget here. This is the Hello World of gadgets. We have a module section, which basically encompasses the entire definition of the gadget. We have a module pref section for declaring things like the gadget's title. And then the content section, which is where we include the HTML and JavaScript that basically describes the application. And so in this particular case, it's really simple. It just says hello world, and that's it. And while you've been at I/O, I'm sure you've been hearing about all the great things that are coming in HTML5, and all of those things you can do inside of gadgets too. So this is the smallest HTML5 gadget that you can fit into a single slide. So this it uses the canvas tag and draws a little blue box. So it's not the most entertaining or useful demo, but this is the same HTML5 that we're talking about and that you've been hearing about over the last 2 days. So this is basically what it looks like. This is living inside of iGoogle. It's really straightforward. This is the HTML5 version of Hello World. So in addition to all of those things, all the stuff that you get just by using HTML and JavaScript and CSS, there are some additional gadget-specific APIs that we give you access to. So the first one of those is the dynamic height library. And what that lets you do is adjust the size of the gadget based on how much content you have inside, right? So if you have a lot of content, you actually can increase the height of the gadget. If you only want to show a little bit of content, you can shrink the size of the gadget. And basically, take up as little UI space as you need inside of the user's screen real estate. The next one of these is the views feature, and views allow you to have multiple facets to your application or your gadget, right? So some common ones that you might have seen if you've ever developed a gadget on iGoogle, for instance, there's the home and the canvas view. The home view is the view that you first see when you install that gadget on your page. That's shared with several other gadgets or your news feeds and things like that. And then the canvas view allows you to take advantage of almost the entire page and gives you a lot more room to work with, right? And we'll see, there are a couple other types of views that are sort of similar to these that are available inside of other pieces of the Google Apps suite. And then finally, we have the osapi.http classes, and these allow you to fetch data from remote sites and bring that data inside of your gadget. And because all of these gadgets are running inside of their own subdomain, you have the normal restrictions of, due to the same origin policy. So your normal XHR requests aren't going to work. So we provide this class so that you can use that instead, so that you can fetch this remote content. And this also gives you things like OAuth signing, so that you have a verifiable way to determine what container or what piece of Google Apps is requesting this data. You have a unique identifier for the user of the gadget at that particular time. And then we also allow you to use the normal HTTP methods, so you can do gets, you can do posts, you can do puts, et cetera. And then finally, we have some helper methods. If you're fetching XML or if you're fetching JavaScript objects, you get back JavaScript objects, right? So if you make a request to a JSON endpoint somewhere, what you get back is actually a JavaScript object that you can just use. You don't have to eval it. Heaven forbid that you ever want to do that in the first place. You don't have to pass it through your own JSON library. You can just start using it right when you get it back. So where do gadgets work? So I've hinted at a couple places already, just talking. The ones we're going to focus on today, I'll give you a brief summary. So the first of those is inside of Google Calendar, right? And so you can see here, this is a simple, what's the next event gadget running on the right-hand side of Google Calendar. Google Calendar provides you with two views. The first one of those is the nav view, which is the one we're looking at here. And the second of which is the canvas view, which actually takes over the frame where your events would normally be and allows you to use that really large section of screen real estate. And then in addition to that, there's also the Google.Calendar APIs, which let you do things like when a user clicks on an event, you can get details about the event that they've clicked on. Or if the user switches what set of dates that they're looking at in the calendar UI, you can get access to those dates inside of your gadget and trigger some special behavior. The next one is Google Sites. And the really cool part of having gadgets inside of sites is that these are really a great way to embed HTML and JavaScript inside of sites, and actually the only way to do that at the moment. And really brings dynamic content to your pages, right? So we have an example here. This is a gadget embedded inside of a quarterly report, and we could have just used an image here, but this is actually going out to a server. It's fetching live data, bringing it back inside of the gadget, and giving us like a live chart based off of data that's actually current, right? So this isn't frozen in time. This is it's live based off of what's happening on our server. And Sites gives you two views similar to these other containers. We have the profile view, which is what you're seeing here, and then there's also a configuration view, which I'll talk a little bit about later, which you can use to actually set up these gadgets when you add them to your site's pages. And then finally, we're going to talk about Gmail. So this gadget we're showing here is, again, the Google Calendar gadget, right? And you've probably seen this inside of Gmail, and you may have said, well, oh, I didn't realize that was a gadget. So this is actually a gadget, right? This is a gadget built by Google using the same technology that we're going to talk about during this presentation that we've used to add a really cool feature to Gmail, right? And so this is the left nav that we're looking at here, and the nav view. And there's also a canvas view, which takes over the mail pane, where you have your inbox or your list of threads or the thread that you're currently looking at, so that you have a really big section of real estate to work with inside of Gmail. And then another place to embed gadgets inside of Gmail, which we actually just announced on Tuesday, is Gmail contextual gadgets. And unfortunately, I can't do contextual gadgets justice talking about them just in this one presentation. So I'm actually giving another session on them today at 4:45. So we'll talk a little bit about them here, and hopefully you'll be really interested in them and come to the other section on those later. So contextual gadgets basically match on the fields of an email message. So who the message is to, who the message is from, a specific pattern that you might see inside of the email body, a link, or an image or something like that. And then based off of those matches, trigger a gadget, which then has access to that particular context. So in this case here, we're looking at the Google Docs contextual gadget. And so, John Doe has sent me a link to an important document, and I could click on that link, and I could open up Google Docs, read the document, come back to my Gmail, and send off a response to this particular message. Or I could actually, using the contextual gadget, click on the show preview option and see the contents of the document right below the email. And then I can read the email, and I can reply to John, without ever having to leave my inbox. So this is a really powerful feature. So I've shown you a little bit about how you can use, or where you can use each of these gadgets. And so you're probably saying, OK, well, I have a basic idea of where they can go, but here are some things that I'm interested in doing. And when I write these gadgets, so like, how do I do things like fetch data? So this is a really common practice. There's basically 4 steps to this. It's actually really simple. The steps are mostly behind the scenes. So using the aforementioned osapi.http class, we would write this little snippet of code here. You can see we're using the get method. You could also use a post or a put, et cetera. You can actually specify a payload if you're interested. We're sending a request to example.com for some JSON. And this is an asynchronous request. We're not going to block the browser. So we need to specify a callback method. And we're going to use that here. So when we call execute, we're going to pass in the method handle response. So whenever this data comes back from the container site, that will call handle response, pass in the JavaScript object that we're given, and then the gadget can do something useful with it. So once we send off this JavaScript request, that's going to go to the container website. In this case, it's my depiction of Google Sites. And then that's going to pass it off to whatever remote site we're requesting the data from. So it could be App Engine. It could be the server that you've already built. It could be a public or a third-party website that has public data. Really any publicly available site on the internet, or even using something like Secure Data Connector, you could request data that's private to your own domain. So that site will receive the request, sends back some data, which will go to the container, and then the container will proxy that data back into the gadget. That's relatively straightforward. You can just start using the data. You can render it inside of the gadget, do all sorts of useful things. So the next thing that we'll talk about is authentication. And this actually works relatively similarly to how you would fetch data, right? So when we make one of these requests to a remote site, we can actually request that the container append some identifying information to that particular request about the user and about what site it's coming from. And we do that by adding this line here. So we have auth_z signed. And what that does is when the request gets to the container will append a unique user ID for the current user, and we also call that the open social ID. And it will cryptographically sign this request. So basically, it takes all of the parameters in the request. If you pass in a payload, if you're using a put or a post, basically mash all of those parameters together, sign them with a secret key that only you as the gadget developer and Google have access to, and then create a hash and append that to the end of the request inside of the URL. So then when the recipient site gets that message, you can then, again, repeat basically the same process. You can push together all of the parameters that were sent in the request using your copy of that secret key, recreate the hash, verify that it's the same, and then you know that the request has come from this particular container that it's identified itself as. And so inside of that request, you have access to this unique user ID, and if you're comfortable just using that, you have this verifiable way to identify a specific user of your gadget. And then the remainder of the steps are the same. The server sends back some data to the container, and the container passes that data back to the gadget. So you might be saying to yourself, well, having that ID is cool, but I have a database, and the database has lots of information about this user. Maybe they already have an account on my site, and I'd like to tie that to this open social ID. Or in the context of using the Google Apps Marketplace, I have this Marketplace application, and that's using OpenID. How would I take this open social ID and tie that to the OpenID? So this is a little bit confusing. I'll walk through it right now briefly. If anyone has any questions on this, please feel free to ask at the end. So the first thing that we do here is we start out sending that request to the remote site, right? So we have the auth signed. This is going to give us that unique open social ID in the request to the server. And so this is some App Engine Python-like pseudocode that you couldn't precisely use inside of your app, but this will give you a pretty good idea of what type of thing we're doing here. And so we get this request. We have the open social ID inside of our database, and so we're going to look for any user that has that open social ID associated with their user object. So we'll do a little query for that here, pulling the value out of the URL. If we happen to not find a user, which will be the first time the gadget loads, we can create a temporary user inside of our database, pass in that open social ID again, and then we're going to save along with that a random value, basically a one-time use token. This could be a session token, any kind of value that you want, as long as you're only going to use it a single time, and you can uniquely associate that with this particular row in the database that we're saving here. And then we'll pass that data, that session token, back to the gadget, along with basically a status. We didn't find the user. You're going to need to do a second step of authentication here, and this will basically indicate to the gadget to initiate that flow. And then in the other case, where we already have this user stored, you don't have to do anything. You can tell the gadget basically they're authenticated. You could also pass back information about that user, whatever data you have stored inside of your application that you want to use inside of the gadget. So right, going back to the flow, we need to do more authentication. So in this particular case, we're going to be sort of focusing on applications using OpenID. So we're going to open up this OpenID URL. This could be a link to your server, basically, where you go through the OpenID flow process. And you'd append to that URL that unique session token that you passed back from your server. All right, so we open this up inside of a window. The user will be prompted to grant access to your site, and log in with their OpenID credentials, which in this case would be through Google Apps. That'll redirect itself a couple times. And then finally, it'll end up on your site, right? And so you'll have details about the user from OpenID. And because you've also passed in the session token, you'll have details about the user's open social ID. And at that point, you can save those in your database. And you know basically who the user is through OpenID. You know who they are through the gadget because you have the two correlated. And then you've also potentially know more information that you've saved in the database because they've logged in through OpenID before. And at this point, you can close the pop-up window with some simple JavaScript. And then inside of the gadget, which can basically check on the status of that pop-up window being the window that created it, you can do sort of a sanity check, right? Send this back to your site, make sure that the user is actually in the database, and hopefully you send back the signal that everything is great. If it's not, maybe the user closed the pop-up window before they actually authenticated, you can throw up a little warning message basically saying, oh, no, we really need you to log in and go through that process one more time. So at this point, the user is logged in. You know who they are in your database. You know what their open social ID is in the database. And every time they load the gadget from this point on, you can just send that one single request, look up that open social ID, and you're done. So the next thing, writing safe gadgets, right? So the most important thing here is stick to the HTML and CSS specs, right? The number one reason to do this, when you go outside of the spec, you're just going to create compatibility problems for yourself, right? Every browser is trying to follow the HTML and CSS specs as closely as possible. Some of them do it a little bit better than others, but they're all on the road to following these specs. And if you follow these, you're going to have the best time in the future, maintaining compatibility. You should also use safe DOM operations, right? Doing things like document.write aren't going to help your application at all. And in the worst case, they're going to open you up to things like cross-site scripting. On the same token, use supported event handlers and timers. All of these things are basically going to ensure compatibility, reduce the scope of possible attacks against your gadgets. And then in order to help you on this goal, we actually recommend the use of the following frameworks, right? So Google Web Toolkit, Open Social Templates, and then jQuery. So here are some examples, the good, the bad, and the ugly of writing safe gadgets. So the first two examples are good ways to append the text hello world to your gadget. The second one is something you definitely don't want to do. And then finally, this is a slightly different class of security exploit. Don't trust things like where you're going to redirect the window to the results of a potentially unsanitized user input, right? So you wouldn't want to call an API method that gets a URL and then just trust the user or some other data that's inside of your system that's never been sanitized. So don't do this. This is very bad. So you have this gadget. It's safe. Uses HTML and CSS specs. It requests data from third parties, and can I authenticate the user? How do you distribute this? So inside of Gmail and Calendar, the contextual gadgets that I mentioned before, and we'll talk a little bit about in my other session, those are distributed through the Google Apps Marketplace. Sidebar gadgets inside of Gmail and Calendar are currently a labs feature. So you would turn on that add gadget by URL lab inside of the Gmail and Calendar UI, and then you just add the link to the gadget inside of that UI, and it appears inside of the navigation. And then Calendar gadgets, actually, there's a little shortcut for this. If you want to paste your gadget XML URL at the end of this, you can actually send this link to someone, and when they visit it, they'll get a little message saying, you're attempting to add this particular gadget to your page and basically ask for permission to do so. And then inside of Sites, Sites actually shares a directory with iGoogle for gadgets. And so if you submit your gadget to iGoogle, it should show up in the Google Sites directory as well. And then there's also the add by URL feature there too. So if you want to add any custom URL, it doesn't have to be listed in the iGoogle directory in order to show up here. Right, and then finally, since a lot of these gadgets, hopefully that you're interested in writing, will be distributed along with other pieces that are in the Google Apps Marketplace, if you want to do things like add a link inside of Google's universal navigation or support OpenID whitelisting so that authentication step I was talking a little bit about before, you can actually skip the user having to do an approval process for that. Or if you want to write Gmail contextual gadgets, you should list in the marketplace. And again, this is another topic that there's just so much to mention that I couldn't do it all in this session. So thankfully, we've had a number of other sessions in the last 2 days about writing for the marketplace. And I'd encourage all of you to check those out. We also have documentation on code.google.com about writing marketplace apps. So let's, I've talked a lot about these different API calls, where these things work. And you haven't seen an example. So let's see an example application that I wrote. This is called TickTrack. And it's a ticket tracking system, and allows you to basically create a ticket queue and assign owners and statuses to email messages that come in, which are basically the tickets in this system. And each of the gadgets that live inside of Google Apps give you specific dashboard views and allow you to take actions based off of these tickets that have come in. So let's just jump to the demo. So here's the application just as it lives by itself. So on the left, we have a list of agents. Here's myself. If I click on myself, I can see all the tickets that I've been assigned. Right here, they all are here. And if I click on one of these, we can see who the email message came from, that it's assigned to me. I could do actions like unassign it or take it, et cetera. Pretty straightforward, right? But this right now lives outside of Google Apps. So if I want to use this, I have to jump over to this app, look at what's in my queue, possibly assign it to someone, go inside of Gmail, take some action, et cetera. And it's a slightly awkward workflow. So how can we make this better? Oops, let me jump back to the slides here. Wrong. Sorry about that. So here's a quick architecture diagram of what this app's going to do, right? So we have this gadget that lives inside of one of these Google apps. We're sending the Open Social ID to the App Engine app, which is the back end here. And to handle the mailing list functionality and the ticket tracking functionality, we're actually using Google Groups. And so that's sending all of the email messages to these particular groups into App Engine using the incoming email API. And then finally, data about the particular thread that we're looking at or the particular agent that's working on these tickets gets sent back to the gadget so that we can display that inside of Google Apps. So first, let's look at the gadget living inside of Google Calendar, right? So here we are, here's today. On the right side, we have a list of threads that I've worked on in the last week, right? So when my manager comes to me and says, hey, Dan, what have you been doing? Yeah, the I/O stuff, okay, I don't really care about that, but what else have you been doing? I can go to this gadget and I can say, well, look, here are the things that I did in the last week, right? So I have these 4 threads. I can see, some basic details about them, what they're called, and get a total of, how many of these things I've worked on. Actually, if I flip back in time, let me flip forward in time for a second and reload this page. All right, if I flip back in time to look at the previous week, I'm actually looking at the particular week that the user is inspecting and passing that into the gadget. So in this case, the gadget then says, oh, well, let's look at the date range that the user is looking at and pull out the threads that he was working on that particular week. So you can see last week I had another simple question I was working on, and it was only 1 thread that week. So I guess I was sort of slacking off. The week before that, we have another 2. And as I flip through these, each one of those date ranges gets passed to the gadget and then loads the tickets from that particular week. And so how are we doing that? We're doing that through the Google Calendar subscribe to dates method. And this is actually really simple. Basically, you just pass in a function that accepts one value, which is the dates that we're looking at, and that's the date range. So we have 2 of those. The first one of those is the start time, and we can convert that into basically a timestamp that we're looking at here. We do that for both of these, and then send that off to App Engine along with my Open Social ID. And because that's already correlated with my user agent inside of the database, it can send back all the tickets that I worked on in that particular week. So the next one that we'll look at here is a gadget in Sites. And this is actually a single gadget that we're looking at here, but it has 4 different views that we've implemented. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we're doing that in just a second. Network's just a little bit slow, okay? And so you can see here we have, on the top left, we have the tickets that are owned by particular people. So you can see, I guess I/O has been taking up a lot of my time. There's a lot of tickets in this queue that haven't been assigned to anyone. You can see I've only done 9 of these here. That's not so good. My manager's going to be unhappy. And if we look at the other details here, you can see the total number of tickets that's come in, how many of those were resolved, the total number of tickets per day. And we can click on all these things. And all of these charts are done by the Google Visualization API, which I'd encourage all of you to check out. It's really awesome. These are super easy to create. And then we have this big number. If we had to have one number about how we're doing, what's the average resolution time on all these tickets, right? So we can see 79.52 hours. That's, again, not very good. My manager's probably going to yell at me about that one. So I have some work to do when I get back. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, so these are all one particular gadget that we've installed. And actually, if I edit the page here, when I click on one of these gadgets, I can pull up the properties, right? So this is similar to what you'd see when you actually install one of these gadgets on your page, right? We have details about how wide is the gadget, how tall is the gadget, do we want to give it a name, right? And this box, this piece at the top here is configuration that we've added inside of the gadget. So when I add this gadget, I can pick what kinds of details I'm interested in displaying. And so this is a really simple example of this, right? I just want to have 4 different views. But we can also do things like, well, what agent do we want to look at, or is there a particular date range that we're interested in looking at instead of just the last 30 days like I'm showing? And we can have different preferences for all of these things. If there's some really complicated logic we wanted to add, we could add that here. And actually, if we wanted to rewrite this entire configuration page, we could do that using the configuration view. So when a person adds this gadget, instead of seeing all of the sites configuration options, we could actually create our own configuration options. So the possibilities for configuring these gadgets is actually quite limitless. And so if we can just see here the gadget here. So this top left one, I'd pick the ownership option, and that's what triggers the display of this particular chart. And inside of the API, we can actually see how we're describing this behavior. So we're using the user prefs API. And so this is the code, the actual code that we're using to display this particular choice. So we're declaring an enum here, the value 0 through 3, and with each one of those, we're giving basically the name that shows up in the UI and associating that with a value. And then when the gadget loads, we request that user pref that's been saved. It's basically an integer display type. And then we have a really simple switch statement that we iterate through and pull out the value and then trigger the right UI behavior based off of the option that was set. And then finally, let's look at the gadget inside of Gmail. And so what this will give us is a list of tickets that are owned by the current user. And we'll just wait for Gmail to refresh itself here really quickly. And so on the left-hand side here, you can see I have 2 tickets that are currently assigned to me. One of these is a simple question. The second one is a tricky question. And I've actually gone through my inbox and triaged these here and added them into this particular label. But let's say that I hadn't done that. Let's say that I was just in my inbox right now, and I want to jump to one of these. So let's click on that little arrow there. We're going to do a little quick search, and then we've pulled up the particular email that I'm interested in working on. All right, that's a simple question. That sounds fine. We'll click on this here. And yeah, we can work on that one. So I'll accept this one. All right, and that's done. I'll work on that later. Let's look at this other one here. And we can actually look at, the question shows up inside of the subject line here. It's a tricky question. Does P equal NP? Well, that sounds kind of hard. So I'm actually not going to work on that one. I'm going to unassign it, pass that to my colleague, and just forget that one's in there. So we'll come back to that one later. All right, so you can see I've basically done the entire triaging process of all these incoming tickets that are assigned to me just from inside of my inbox. I didn't have to jump over to another app. I can do all of that here without interrupting my workflow. And actually, one more thing that I'll show you here, just as another little teaser for contextual gadgets. I can actually jump into one of these, and you notice this is being triggered on the particular mailing list here. So this is my mail queue, right? And so I have a contextual gadget installed that will actually look for messages sent to that alias. And when those messages come in, if I happen to open them inside of my inbox, it actually triggers this particular gadget to show up at the bottom. So I can see here that this is unassigned. And actually, why don't I assign that to one of my colleagues too? So now it's actually taken care of. And if I go back to the search results, I can actually remove this from my queue. And it's been completely triaged. So I've actually gone in, assigned an owner inside of the inbox, removed a label, and now it wouldn't even show up inside of my follow-up without ever having to leave my message inbox at all. And on this particular one, I can actually shoot off a reply as well. So I'll say, oh, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? I can answer this with a question. African or European? Send that off. And I can mark it as resolved, and I'm done. So I haven't had to leave my inbox, and I've actually answered the ticket, gone through the entire workflow of working on one of these tickets that's come in my inbox without ever having to leave, without ever having to go to one of these other apps. So if you're interested on how I wrote that app, again, I'd encourage you to come to the talk later. So finally, let's talk about the application manifest. So this is based on the context of being part of a Google Apps Marketplace application. So for doing things like adding a link into the universal navigation or whitelisting for OpenID, this is basically the small set of lines that you need to add to one of those manifests in order to have those features work. And then gadgets are not currently installable via the marketplace except for contextual gadgets, but we're hoping on having those extensions available soon. So you'd have a couple more lines here if you want to add a sidebar gadget in Gmail or a sidebar gadget in Calendar or a gadget in Sites. So hopefully I've convinced you all to get started writing these gadgets for yourself. And so we have developer documentation on all of these different types of gadgets, Gmail gadgets, both contextual and sidebar, calendar gadgets, sites gadgets, and some documentation on the marketplace. And we have a developer forum for these gadgets as well. So if you have any questions on writing gadgets for Google Apps, I'd encourage you to go here. I'll give you a second if you want to copy that down. There's also links to that from each of these developer sites too. So it's fairly easy to find. And like I said, other talks, contextual gadgets today in this room at 4:45. And then I'd encourage all of you to look at the other enterprise talks that are available when they're posted on the Google I/O website if you weren't fortunate enough to see them already. And so now I think it's time for questions. So I'll switch over to the Wave here. I'll give you all a second if you want to open this up too. And I think they have it in Firefox. All right, excellent. So we have some questions already. And if anyone else has live questions, you can feel free to come up to one of the mics, and I'll hopefully answer whatever burning questions you have. We'll start with one of the moderator questions, though. So we have Google site for our corporate domain, so all of our users have already logged in. Is there any other way to pass the username to a gadget so we can give them customized content? Yes, OK, excellent. So hopefully I've partially answered this particular question, right? So this is a type of single sign-on that you'd like to do inside of a gadget. And the easiest way to do that is with OpenID. And you can have OpenID turned on for any Google Apps domain. And so it's basically the process that I outlined, right? So you would load the gadget. You'd have it send a request with the OpenSocial ID to your server that you've configured. You would save that ID in whatever users table you have. And if you can then associate that with your data, you're good to go. If not, walk through the OpenID flow and then pass that basically back into your database. So you have the user signed in once using OpenID. If they're already installed or already logged into Google Sites, they won't need to log in again. And more importantly, if you've installed this application through the Google Apps Marketplace, there's whitelisting. So you won't even need to walk through the flow. The pop-up window will open, do a couple automatic redirections, and then you're done. So yes, this is very possible. And hopefully my explanation of this has been sufficient. If not, feel free to come up to me after, if you're here. Want to take a live question?
I'm just wondering about the monetization of this.
Mm-hmm.
In the Gadget API terms of service, it says that you can't sell a gadget.
So is this the generic gadgets terms of service, or?
I believe so.
OK. So I'd have to look into the particular thing that's showing there. So right now, because these aren't part of the Google Apps Marketplace, it could be out of date. I'm sure it could stand to be updated for this particular context.
It's just, we're very interested in pursuing this, but if, as you can imagine, if you can't get paid for it, it's...
Yep.
OK, so how do you actually follow up on, how does one follow up on that then?
I'll give you my email address after.
OK, that'd be great. Yep. And then the other thing is just about stripping the Google identifications, all of that off. Apparently, you can't do that either under the terms of service in terms of the add Google button and all of that kind of stuff.
So that's mostly in the context of like syndicated gadgets and not so much a gadget that's living inside of Sites or Gmail.
But there's no distinction in the terms of service.
Right. So like I said, they could probably stand to be updated for the marketplace and all of that context.
OK.
So I'll make sure that we get a lawyer to look at it.
OK, thanks a lot.
Yep.
Hello. I have one simple question. Is it possible to parse the content of an email and to use it within a gadget?
So I guess the question is related to contextual gadgets.
Right.
So my talk will expand a little bit on that. It is sort of possible. I mean, it really depends, right? So the contextual gadget will basically request access to particular parts of the email. And so one of those parts would be like the message body. And so assuming that the domain administrator has approved access for your particular gadget to look at that part of the email, you then could do some parsing of it. Generally, we wouldn't want these gadgets to match on every single email message, so you'd be matching on some other piece of content before looking at the email body. But yes, it is possible if the domain administrator approves it.
Thanks.
Yep. Live questions? Yeah.
You've mentioned a lot about contextual gadgets and the domain administrators and marketplaces and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any plans to make contextual gadgets available to regular Gmail accounts?
So we're thinking about ways that we could do that right now, but we don't have anything in particular to announce.
OK, thanks.
Yep. All right, we'll do the rest of the questions here. Will third-party gadgets ever be able to open docked overlays in Google Apps like the Gtalk chat windows in Gmail? That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. So I'm going to have to punt on that one. Is the person who asked that here, by any chance? Yes, okay. Follow up with me after, and I'll give you my email address. When will apps, marketplace apps, be able to deploy Gmail sidebar gadgets? So we don't have the exact answer to this one right now. We really want to do this, and I can say that it's coming, but I don't know exactly when. So it's definitely something that people are interested in, and we definitely want to do it. There's some particular UI issues that we're looking at. So if you happen to have, let's say 10 sidebar gadgets installed, those are all going to run down the left side. We want to make sure that it's a good user experience before we turn this on for everyone. So that's one of the things that we're still thinking about. And the final question, how does the Gadget API compare to iWidget, and are both the open standard? So I'm not that familiar with iWidget. I looked into it a little bit before the talk, because I saw this question was in here. At some level, I think they're fairly similar. I mean, they're both basically HTML and JavaScript living inside of another app. So in that particular sense, they're the same. I don't know about iWidget's open source, whether that's been open sourced or not. All the gadgets that I talked about today are based on the Open Social spec, which is an open standard. The implementation, the standard implementation of this, the reference container, I guess, is Apache Shindig, and that's an Apache project, which is also open source. So you can feel free to look at the spec, and all the code for running one of these gadgets, that's all open. So as far as this is concerned, this Gadget API is an open standard. I don't know if it's the open standard, but it is certainly an open standard. Any other questions? OK. Well, thank you all for coming.